If the Lord be for us, who can be against us? In this segment of the Theological Journal, we turn to the Protestant Reformed Journal and the article recounting the seminary's history, Protestant Reformed Church of America. Finances. That the school was a denominational seminary means, among other things, that the denomination completely supported the school. It did so by assessing a certain amount per year to each family. In the early years, with 2 part-time professors and no dedicated school building, the school was inexpensive to run. Inexpensive, that is, when comparing the school's total budget to what a working man's salary may have been. The total budget for 1930 was $2,200. Assessments per family in the early years were in the range of $1.50 to $2 annually. But these were the years of the Great Depression and the beginning of World War II. The reader must not suppose that the members of the PRCA did not bend over backwards for the support of the school. As with all aspects of the denomination's finances and the cause of Christian education, they did. Perhaps this explains why the treasurer reported periodically that the school was short of funds, or soon would be if the churches did not pay their assessments. Perhaps the most urgent notice is that of the treasurer to the meeting of the curatorium on June 1, 1937. Quote, one treasurer, Reverend Jonker, reports that he has a balance on hand of $47.79, but he also must pay $300 on bills due. Also that he must pay school rent, plus repay overpaid assessments, plus pay Reverend G.M. Offoff's salary, plus pay one of our student instructors. Furthermore, he reports that various churches failed to pay even part of their assessments. Evidently, Classis' response to the treasurer in 1927 did not deter him from reporting financial shortfalls in the future. The treasurer of the curatorium reports that there are not sufficient funds in the treasury of the theological school. Decided to appoint a committee to make arrangements for the matter. Committee, the aforementioned treasurer. Because the school was supported by the denomination, it has been and is yet today the practice of the PRCA not to charge tuitions to students who intend to enter the ministry of the PRCA, and to charge only a nominal tuition fee to students from other denominations. However, during the Depression year, the curatorium passed a motion to ask for $25 per year tuition fee of each student. What is not clear is whether this is a suggested amount or an absolute requirement. The fee was raised in 1939, and any ambiguity about whether the fee was optional was removed. Classis adopted the proposal of the curatorium that a $70 per annum should be required of each student. We'll pick that up in our next session now for the Reformed Theological Journal on the Psalms and the Christian life. In a University sermon on Psalm 84, Thomas Aquinas notes that in the ancient world many sought happiness in the possession of worldly goods, such as wealth, power, honor, fame, and desire. Thomas argues that worldly goods such as these, whatever temporary happiness they may provide, are inadequate objects of perfect happiness, Because we can never get enough of them, they can never satisfy our cravings. They can never give rest to our souls. Moreover, due to their inherent fragility, even the limited joy they bring is always mixed with sadness and in fear. Quote, the more we love the goods we possess, the more affliction they bring about as for fear of losing them. Because worldly goods lack permanence and security, they cannot make us perfectly happy. Thomas, following the psalmist, proclaims that perfect happiness can only be found in the Lord's house. Blessed are those who dwell in your house, Psalm 84:4. More recently in his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Carl Trueman has shown that for many in the late modern West, happiness is defined primarily in psychological categories. Happiness lies in deciding for myself who I want to be and in receiving recognition and affirmation from broader society, ideally through political mechanisms of my self-chosen identity. Following Thomas's example above, I would suggest that the self and society's affirmation of the self is also a fragile frame for securing happiness, John 5:44. Aristotle is right. Though the pursuit of happiness is universal, people disagree about what happiness is and how to achieve it. Where then does the Psalters claim that the Christian life is the good life fit among these competing visions of human happiness and its acquisition? In our short time, we cannot possibly explore the full treasury of the Psalters' teaching on the good life. I propose instead to consider how the Psalms aim to make us whole and happy persons, holy and happy in God by instructing us on three topics: God's house, which is the end of the good life; God's instruction, which is the way of the good life; 3, God's anointed King, in whom the end and way of the good life are personally embodied. According to the Psalter, the good life is found ultimately in God's house by following the path of God's instruction and in fellowship with God's anointed King. The first point, God's house, the end of good life. According to the Psalms, the good life is ultimately realized through residence in God's house, the temple God has established on Mount Zion. Blessed are those who dwell in your house, ever singing your praise, Psalm 84, Psalm 23:6. God's dwelling place in Zion is both a political and cultic reality, a palace where the divine king reigns and a temple where the divine king is worshipped. Zion is the glad recipient of the evangelical announcement, the Lord reigns, Psalm 97:1. The Lord installs his anointed king in Zion, Psalm 2:6, and sends forth his royal scepter from Zion to rule in the midst of enemies, Psalm 110:2. As the dwelling place of the divine king and his anointed son, Zion is the pinnacle of beauty, the joy of all the earth, Psalm 80:48-2. The streams of Zion's river make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High, Psalm 46:4. Zion is secure, abiding forever, Psalm 48:8. The source of salvation and blessing, Psalm 22. At the seat of God's international rule, the house of God in Zion is also the center of international worship, where God's anointed king ministers as the Melchizedekian priest, Psalm 110, verse 4. Not only do the Lord's servants stand in the house of the Lord to serve him day and night, Psalm 134:1. The princes of the people also gather as the people of the God of Abraham in his sovereign holy presence. Psalm 47:8-9, 68:29. To call upon his name, to offer burnt offerings, and to perform their vows. Worshippers in God's temple behold the beauty of his glory. Psalm 27:4. Feast on the abundance of his house and drink from the river of his delights. Psalm 36:8. Those he chooses and brings near are happy. They are satisfied with the goodness of his house, the holiness of his temple. Psalm 65:4. They flourish like a green olive in his presence. Psalm 52:8. Ever singing his praise. Psalm 84:4. The Psalter portrays God's house in Zion as our supreme good and final end. In Psalm 84, the psalmist declares, "The day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper, occupying the lowest social station in the house of my God, than dwell in the tents of wickedness." In Psalm 137:6, the psalmist pronounces a curse on himself if he fails to remember Zion or set Jerusalem above his highest joy. As our supreme good, God's house is also our final end and goal of all our quests and the end of our journeys. Forever a faithful person on the pilgrimage in this world, Augustine says, there is nothing more agreeable than the thought of the city, which is the goal of our journey. There all thirsts are quenched, and all hungers satisfied. 63:1 and 2, 65:4, and 84 verse 2. So Zion, in the article by Scott Swain on the Psalms. Now we turn to the Old Testament in the book of Acts by Professor Schreiner in the Southwestern Theological Journal. The Israelites wandered, a rich Old Testament tradition includes the lame at the day of salvation. Jeremiah said God would gather his people from the remote regions of the earth. The blind and the lame will be with him. Jeremiah 31:8. In Zephaniah 3:19, it says, I will save the lame and gather the outcasts. I will make those who are disgraced throughout the earth receive praise and fame. Micah 4:6-7 speaks similarly. On that day, this is the Lord's declaration. I will assemble the lame and gather the scattered, those I have injured. I will make the lame into a remnant, those far removed into a strong nation. Then the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion from this time on and forever. Emphasis added. Peter takes the lame by the right hand, raises him up, and the man enters the temple and begins walking, leaping, and praising God. Luke employs a rare word for the man's jumping, holamai. This word is also found in Isaiah when the prophet speaks of the lame leaping like a deer, Isaiah 35:6. The priests and captain of the temple oppose the apostles, 4:1. Peter preaches Jesus as the rejected stone, 4:11, Psalm 118:22. And then God shakes the earth again like Sinai when his people pray, 4:31. The narrative is filled with temple themes. A new temple community has arrived with Jesus as the cornerstone. A small narrative in Acts 4:32-5:11 further defines Israel, building on a summary of 2:44-47. Barnabas's generosity in the new community is contrasted with Ananias and Sapphira. The temple was more than a religious center. It was also a social, political, and economic center from which the blessings of God flowed to the world. Luke highlights the gift of Barnabas, who was a Cyprian Levite. Levites were set apart to perform priestly duties, Numbers 1:47 to 53. Following the golden calf incident, a new Levite joins the community in contrast to the priestly rulers who oppose Peter and John. Luke, however, juxtaposes Barnabas's generosity with Ananias and Sapphira, who lie about their gift. The Old Testament echo points to their action being not merely an arbitrary sin, but an improper temple offering in contrast to the Levite's gift. Jeremiah condemned the temple for becoming a den of robbers, and God's judgment is banishment from his presence. Allusions to Ezekiel 20 also arise in the midst of a restoration text when the Lord says, I will purge those of you who rebel and transgress against me. Ezekiel 20:38. Then the Lord will accept his people as a pleasing aroma and will demonstrate his holiness through them in the sight of the nations. Ananias and Sapphira's dead bodies are removed, keeping the holy place pure, as when Achan was removed in the wilderness, Joshua 7. The boundaries of the new congregation are defined. The second temple narrative is similar to the first, but this time the focus is on opposition. Yet God redeems the new congregation from their troubles and trials. A second transition occurs with the selection of the seven to serve the Hellenistic widows, Acts 6:1-7. Now the concern fans out, not away from Israel, but to those who are influenced by Greek culture. He's going to argue it shifts to the Samaritans and then ultimately to the world, as he promised in the intro. Their Greek enculturation caused them to be objects of scorn. But God has already indicated he is bringing people in from the margins. Acts 2:9-11, Isaiah 43:5-7. The barriers between Hellenized and Hebraic Jews are overcome as 7 Hellenistic leaders are chosen to care for Hellenistic widows. As the community expands, God directs its generosity to all who enter and also introduces Hellenized leaders, Stephen and Philip. Even priests end up believing, Acts 6:7. The Jerusalem narrative comes to a climax at Stephen's trial, his speech, and his death. 6:8-8, 3. Opposition had been escalating, and now a Hellenized witness is martyred. Stephen is accused of disrespecting the temple and law. He responds with a salvation historical argument about the temporal and corrupt nature of the physical temple and the reception of God's prophets through history. So he's focusing here on the Jerusalem period, Acts 1-7, 8-3 actually, and it'll begin to shift. So we'll pick this up from Southwestern Theological Journal on our next sitting, as we turn to the Princeton Theological Review of 1837, a book review by James Waddell Alexander of Mr. Henry's Life of Calvin. And it's an exquisite article. We had been brought down to 1541, Calvin attended the Ratisbon Conference, and he was not happy with Bucer or Melanchthon, who were equivocating on the Eucharistic presence as too cute by half. And Calvin sees through the subtleties and the studied ambiguities to try to reach and accommodate some kind of union with Rome. For Calvin, it's overdone. He sees through it, and he dislikes the subtlety and the gamemanship of both Melanchthon and Bucer. We pick up here. It is delightful to contemplate the mutual affection of Calvin and Melanchthon. As it regards temperament, each appears to have had a supplementary quality which was necessary to the other. Calvin, though more bold than Melanchthon, was less heroic than Luther, and sometimes melted into gentleness. The amiable aspect of his character, says Mr. Henry, has even till our day been overlooked. He fully understood the excellencies of his German brother and fraternally reprimanded him when he shrunk from duty. Writing to Melanchthon on a certain occasion, Calvin says, "Would God we could confer together. I know your candor, ingenuousness, and moderation. Your piety is attested by angels in the world. In times of wretchedness and conflict, it would be of no small solace to me to embrace you before we leave this world." We would interject here that this is so often overlooked by those who basically hate Calvin's theology of the sovereignty of God and its God's majesty. And Calvin can at times be sharp and critical, but they miss the entire warmth that he had for so many friends for so long. When Calvin's faithful reproofs had for a short time offended Melanchthon, we find the former thus addressing him: "Our attachment, which springs from the community of religious feeling, must be unalterable and eternal. The good of the church is connected with our harmony." After the death of Melanchthon, Calvin addresses his spirit in this touching apostrophe: "And thou, O Philip Melanchthon, for I invoke thee, who now livest with Christ in God, awaiting the day when we shall be gathered to you in blissful quietness. Thou hast 100 times said, when weary with labors and oppressed with trials, thou hast laid thine head affectionately in my bosom. Oh, that I might die upon this breast. 1,000 times since have I wished that we could meet. Thou would certainly have been more daring in conflict, and more prompt in despising the malice of men and their false accusations, and thus might have restrained the dishonesty of many, who grew more audacious in insult by reason of what they deemed thy timidity." The very time when Calvin was on his journey to Worms with Capito, Bucer, and Sturmius, the people of Geneva, repenting of their misdeeds, were taking measures to recall him. Some of his personal enemies had been removed by signal dispensations of providence. One of the malignant syndics had been convicted of sedition and was killed by a fall from a window as he was trying to escape. Another had been found guilty of murder and was beheaded. 2 others, detected in a conspiracy, fled. Farel and Calvin were now, I guess this is 1541, in a season of calm reflection, viewed in a true light and invited to return. The Neuchâtel people absolutely refused to part with Farel. The council at Geneva wrote a letter to Calvin, which he showed to Bucer and the brethren, and the latter replied to it, saying that one sentiment had constantly ruled Calvin's breast, namely the desire for their salvation, even if this should cost his greatest exertions, yes, even his own blood. But they added that they were all about to visit Worms on business of the greatest public importance, and they counseled them to send for Peter Viret, and Guillaume Farel. The Genovese made a second application, but the Strasbourg brethren employed the intervention of Bucer, Sturmius, and Capito to dissuade Calvin. The people of Geneva, still not disheartened, prevailed upon the churches of Zurich, Bern, and Basel to plead their cause. In May 1541, an act of condemnation was solemnly rescinded. Amy Perini, a former syndic, proceeded from Strasbourg to Worms in order to show the Reformed ministers there how favorable an opportunity was now afforded the propagating of the gospel in France, which had such an effect that Bucer and his colleagues changed their whole plan and urged upon Calvin the duty of an immediate return to Geneva. Bullinger wrote a pressing letter to the church at Strasbourg, urging them to acquiesce. Viret, who was engaged at Geneva for 6 months, joined with Farel in beseeching Calvin to resume his labors among them. The effect of these concurrent solicitations on the mind of Calvin was a state of perplexity and agitation which he declared no words could describe. In a letter to Farel, Calvin says, "It has certainly been good news to me that a measure of peace has been established at Geneva. I have only to wish that they had united themselves in the Lord. For as long as you have said, so long as the Lord is not our band of union, the union is accursed." Excuse me. It is more on one account that I have constantly told you that the mere thought of a return to Geneva terrifies me. Not only am I alarmed at your persevering demands, though I acknowledge this is the chief source of my distress, but there are other reasons. The further I advance, the clearer is my view of the precipice from which the Lord has delivered me. We will pick that up next time from the 1837 Princeton Theological Journal. As we turn to Concordia Theological Journal, and give me a second here. On the need for Lutheran confessions in Lutheran schools. He's talking about Luther. Luther's argument identifies the numerous relationships within which the school exists. Its curriculum must be driven by the needs of the constituency it serves. It serves the city by shaping the boys and girls who will eventually step into leadership roles in family, governance, and work. In Luther's words, in order to maintain the temporal estate outwardly, the world must have good, capable men and women, men able to rule well over land and people, women able to manage the household and train children and servants aright. Therefore, it is a matter of properly educating and training our boys and girls to that end. It serves the church by preparing boys for theological study. Luther's curricular suggestions are undergirded by his understanding of the social relationships of the school and the vocation's specific norms. Luther's later work, the 1530 Sermon on Keeping Children in School, follows a similar method. As Luther indicates in the introductory letters, the sermon is aimed at parents. We would notice that in the expropriation and the closing down of monasteries, associated schools went away. So the argument by Luther to the princes is, let's get the schools going. Some city leaders had already listened to Luther's 1524 admonition and provided schools for the children of their cities. In other cities, pious and faithful citizens had pushed their city councils into action. However, in some city schools were underutilized because parents came to believe the dastardly notion that because of monkery, nunning, and priestcraft no longer hold out the hope they once did, such as getting into government jobs. There is therefore no more need for study and for learned men. But instead, we need to give thought only on how to living and getting rich. Luther is bold enough to claim that clergy must encourage and admonish parents to take advantage of the schools for the city of the church and sake. Luther mercilessly criticizes the claim that occupational training is sufficient education. His rhetoric is harsh. He points out that parents who refuse to permit their boys to be educated may well be robbing the world of future pastors. They might thus be contributing to the eternal damnation of many souls who would otherwise have been saved through the preaching of these young men. Got a footnote. This is not to say that Luther was opposed to occupational training. On the contrary, in a letter to the councilman, he explicitly states, "My idea is to have the boys attend such a school for 1 or 2 hours during the day and spend the remainder of their time working at home, learning a trade, or doing whatever is expected of them." His point is that occupational training alone is not enough to provide for the kind of life that God would have the Christian enjoy. If the parents had sent their children to these schools, there might have been ministers for the city. Later in the sermon, Luther lauds the work of civil servants, claiming, "We shamefully despise God when we begrudge our children this glorious and divine work and stick them instead in the exclusive service of the belly and avarice, having them learn nothing but how to make a living like hogs, wallowing forever with their noses in the dunghill, and never training them for so worthy an office and estate." Luther calls withholding a good education from children service of mammon, caring for their bellies, horribly ungrateful, and idolatry. To people who do so, Luther says, you want God to serve you free of charge, both with preaching and with worldly government, so that you can just calmly turn your child away from him and teach him to serve mammon alone. As beneficiaries of the social order and Christians who are to love their neighbors, parents have a duty to ensure their children receive a proper education. Such an education requires students to learn the important languages of the day, the wisdom of the intellectual tradition, and the ability to think and write. This is true for boys and girls, but particularly true for any boy who would eventually become a theologian. Luther argues that even boys of lesser ability should receive such an education. They ought at least to be able to read, write, and understand Latin. For we need not only highly learned doctors and masters of Holy Scripture, but also ordinary pastors who will teach the gospel and catechism to the young and ignorant, and baptize and administer the sacrament. That they may be capable of doing battle with heretics is unimportant. Latin is a necessary part of their education. Likewise, boys who might serve in civil administration or in the private sector need such an education, because it is not the law of the fist, but the law of the head that must rule, not force, but wisdom and reason, among the wicked as well as the good. An education in Latin and the classics provides youngsters with the linguistic facilities, cultural literacy, and body of wisdom they need to help preserve the law. Luther concedes that not every boy will become a pastor or civil servant. Nevertheless, his education will not hurt his capacity to earn a living. On the contrary, it can rule his house all the better because of it. And besides, he is prepared for the office of pastor or preacher if he should be needed there. As proper, education prepares students to love their neighbors more effectively in all their vocations. We'll bring this to an end and pick up our latter readings in another segment. With St. Paul, we say, if God be for us, who can be against us? Who can lay anything to the charge of God's elect? Jesus Christ has been raised from the dead and raised to the right hand of God, who there intercedes for us. Who can lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It's God who justifies. May the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and fellowship of the Holy Ghost be with us all evermore.